At precisely 8:03 a.m., Judge Danielle Carter stepped out of her charcoal gray sedan and approached the stone steps of the Westbridge Federal Courthouse, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer, polished heels, and carrying a slim leather folio. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to announce who she was. Her salt and pepper curls, coiled tightly against her scalp, glinted in the morning sun. She chose not to wear her judicial robe outside the courtroom. Never had. To Danielle, authority wasn't about show. It was about presence, about principle. She preferred to walk through the world like a citizen, grounded, alert, and wholly composed. But as she neared the security checkpoint, that calm began to unravel. Not from her own doing, but from the hostility that greeted her. Deputy Mark Dempsey, a long-time courthouse bailiff, known for his rigid demeanor and unapologetically narrow worldview, intercepted her without even glancing at the badge clipped inside her blazer. "Step aside, ma'am," he barked, his voice thick with suspicion and disdain. Danielle raised an eyebrow and calmly extended her federal credentials. Dempsey barely looked at them. Instead, he snatched the badge and pocketed it with a grunt, dismissing her silent protest. "You think that badge means something? Here," he sneered. "Follow me." Without consent, he gripped her arm and led her away from the line of civilians and attorneys, past the scanner, down a side hallway, and into a small, sterile screening room where protocol had long since been perverted into a tool for intimidation. Inside the room was cold and clinical fluorescent lights, a steel chair, a metal cart with scanning equipment, and a pair of electric clippers that rested ominously on the edge. Danielle stood her ground. "I do not consent to this," she stated firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. Dempsey ignored her. "You're acting suspicious," he said flatly. "That's cause enough." When she didn't comply, 2 additional officers stepped in. One restrained her left arm, the other held the chair steady. Before she could process the full weight of what was happening, the clippers buzzed to life. Cold steel touched her scalp. One lock of hair fell, then another. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't give them that. Instead, she sat frozen in the chair, her dignity stripped one strand at a time, while laughter echoed from behind her. "Now you look more presentable," Dempsey muttered. Her hands shook, knuckles pale, but her voice, when it finally returned, was calm, deliberate. "You'll regret this," Dempsey scoffed. "People like you always say that." He opened the door and gestured sarcastically. "Courtroom's that way, sweetheart." Danielle retrieved her badge without a word and walked out. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before. Her scalp tingled from the assault. Her breath was shallow but steady. Each step echoed against the marble floor like a drumbeat, quiet but unyielding. She passed clerks who turned their eyes away and attorneys who whispered behind cupped hands, unaware of the weight of what had just transpired behind closed doors. As she neared the courtroom doors, Danielle paused. Inside a high-profile civil rights case awaited her a hearing regarding police brutality during a recent protest, one that had drawn national media and courtroom observers. This was not just another case, it was a reckoning. And now, after everything that had just occurred, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The judge had been violated. The very system she upheld had assaulted her, but she wouldn't be silenced. She wouldn't flinch. She squared her shoulders, reached for the heavy doors, and pushed them open. The courtroom fell into silence. Conversations halted. Heads turned. Confusion rippled through the room like a shockwave. Danielle walked slowly past rows of lawyers, defendants, and journalists, each step a revelation. Her scalp, unevenly shaved, was the most honest indictment of the system anyone would see that day. Her robe waited at the bench, folded neatly over her chair. Without asking for help, she slipped it on like armor, her gaze unwavering, because in that moment she was no longer just a judge, she was a mirror held up to a broken system. And what came next would not be about courtroom decorum, it would be about justice rising quietly and fiercely from behind those very closed doors. The double doors creaked open, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. What had moments ago been a buzz of casual conversation among attorneys, reporters, and litigants fell silent as Danielle Carter entered. Her appearance stopped time. The silver badge clipped to her blazer had meant nothing to some, but here in this room, her presence meant everything. Her freshly shaven scalp, still bearing the jagged edges of cruelty, was now visible under the unforgiving lights. Some people gasped, others fumbled with their phones, unsure whether to stand or stare. No one could have imagined that the woman they'd just seen humiliated in the hallway was now the one who would command the bench. As she stepped past the gallery, the weight of realization rippled through the room. This wasn't just a judge presiding over a civil rights hearing. This was a reckoning walking in on 2 feet. Danielle moved with deliberate calm, her robe draped over her left arm. She reached the judge's bench without assistance, lifted the garment, and slid it over her shoulders with slow, precise movements. Her every step, every breath was not just a recovery, it was a declaration. Once seated, she scanned the courtroom without expression. Her voice, steady and cold, broke the stillness. We will begin with Case 382C, the United States versus the Westbridge Police Department, allegations of excessive force and civil rights violations. A moment later, her eyes found him, Deputy Mark Dempsey, standing stiffly near the side door. The same man who had shaved her head just moments earlier. His face had turned pale, his mouth parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "Deputy Dempsey," she said sharply. "Step forward." The silence that followed was unbearable. All eyes turned toward Dempsey as he hesitated, then finally shuffled into the center of the room. His badge, once a symbol of authority, now looked like a stain against his uniform. "State your name for the record," Danielle ordered Mark. "Mark Dempsey," he muttered. She leaned forward, voice like steel. "And how long have you served in this courthouse?" 15 years, he answered. She paused, tapped her pen, once, then twice against the desk. "And in those 15 years, how many women have you unlawfully detained in that room?" Dempsey looked around for support, but none came. I don't know," Danielle's voice cut through him. 12 formal complaints, all buried. I have them in front of me." She then turned to the bailiffs flanking the exit. "Deputy Dempsey, you are hereby placed under arrest for assault, abuse of authority, and violation of federal civil rights law. Remove him from my courtroom." Gasps filled the air as 2 officers moved forward and placed Dempsey in handcuffs. He protested weakly, his voice lost in the rising murmurs. The moment was surreal. One of the courthouse's most feared and unchallenged figures, now silenced, restrained, and exposed. But Danielle didn't pause. She turned to her clerk. "Bring in the first witness." A man stepped forward. Isaiah Burton, a janitor who had worked in the courthouse for nearly 2 decades. He took the stand, voice shaking, and testified that he'd seen Dempsey repeatedly target young black men and women for unnecessary searches. He called it cleaning up the hallways, Isaiah said, looking down. "We all knew, but no one did anything." Danielle didn't speak. She simply nodded for the next witness. More followed. A court reporter who had filed a complaint about Dempsey following her to her car, a law clerk who overheard him boasting about how fear keeps order, an assistant district attorney who admitted he had been told by his supervisor not to pursue internal investigations against courthouse security. Testimony after testimony peeled back layers of silence, revealing a system held together not by justice but by complicity. Each voice was different, yet all spoke of the same rot of whispered warnings of institutional indifference and of the quiet agony of being seen and dismissed. Danielle listened to every word, her pen moving steadily across the pages of her legal pad, documenting each truth like a record being carved into stone. And then came the tipping point. Denise Harper, a retired courthouse clerk with years of personnel files in her possession, took the stand. She confirmed that many of the complaints had indeed been buried, marked resolved when they were not removed from internal databases altogether. "There's a whole system built to protect men like him," she said, her voice thick with anger. "And I was part of it. I'm sorry, Judge Carter." Danielle's expression softened just slightly. Your testimony today matters. Let it begin here. The courtroom remained still, many wiping tears from their eyes, not from sadness, but from the catharsis of seeing truth, long suppressed, finally spoken into daylight. By the end of the day, the courthouse no longer felt like the same place it had been just hours before. What began as a routine hearing had become a forum for systemic exposure. Danielle Carter had not only unseated a predator in uniform, but also dismantled the shield of silence that had protected him. And yet she showed no triumph in her eyes, only resolve. This was only the beginning. What had been buried was now unearthed, and the courtroom, once a symbol of quiet compliance, had become a crucible of truth. The gavel struck once, echoing like a warning through the chamber. Judge Danielle Carter sat firmly on the bench, but the courtroom around her felt less like a courtroom and more like a witness stand for an entire system. With each new folder submitted into evidence, it became clear this wasn't just about one deputy's misconduct, it was about the culture that enabled it. Danielle's eyes narrowed as she opened a sealed envelope marked "Confidential." Inside were grievance reports going back 10 years, most of them stamped, reviewed and closed by none other than Judge Alan Whitmore, her mentor, her trusted guide through her early years in law. She sat back stunned. His signature was unmistakable. He had seen every complaint, he had closed every case, and yet the world still spoke his name with reverence, as if justice had always worn his robe with pride. The silence in the room deepened as Danielle called the next witness. Patrice Morgan, a retired court clerk, shuffled to the stand. She clutched a stack of old printed emails and worn legal forms. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the burden of long-held truth. "I worked under Judge Whitmore for 12 years, she began. We were told to mark certain reports as addressed, even when they weren't, especially when they involved staff misconduct. She held up one memo. This woman, Sandra Ellis, reported that she was strip-searched by Deputy Dempsey. In 2017, I entered the complaint into the system, but when I went back to check it, it was gone, completely deleted." Gasps spread across the gallery. Patrice continued. "It wasn't just him. Any complaint that made this courthouse look bad, we were told to bury it." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but resolute. "Who told you to do that?" Ms. Morgan. Patrice paused. "Judge Whitmore himself. Or, through his assistants, he didn't want another scandal. Said we were here to protect the integrity of the institution, not air dirty laundry." Danielle's expression didn't change, but the heartbreak in her eyes was visible. Whitmore had once been the man who urged her to run for judge, who taught her that the law was the highest calling. And yet here she sat uncovering how he had used his position not to shine a light on injustice, but to build shadows deep enough to hide it. The betrayal was personal, but Danielle didn't flinch. She turned to the bailiff. "Enter these statements into the official record," she instructed. "All of them." As the morning turned to afternoon, more people came forward. A former paralegal named Andre Lewis told the court he'd been threatened with termination after trying to report a wrongful arrest. "I saw the footage. Dempsey tackled a teenager for not having ID. When I said something, I got pulled into HR and warned not to stir trouble." His voice broke. "That kid never came back. I think about him every day." An interpreter named Maria Gonzalez testified next. She had once tried to intervene when a Spanish-speaking mother was detained without understanding her rights. "They told me to stay in my lane," she said bitterly. "Told me I didn't know what real justice looked like." Danielle nodded solemnly, her pen scratching furiously as she documented each statement. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Inside, however, it was the faces in the pews that mattered more. Everyday citizens, families of victims, courthouse staff who had never dared speak before. A young woman stood trembling and asked if she could speak. Danielle permitted it. "I was 17 when I came here for a juvenile hearing. I was stopped at the door by a guard who said I was too distracting and made me change clothes. I had to sit through my own trial in someone else's sweatshirt." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I didn't even know I could report it. I thought that was normal." The air in the room had grown thick with pain and memory, but no one interrupted. They listened. For the first time in years, these voices were not dismissed. They were centered, and then Danielle made a decision that changed the tone of the entire proceeding. She stood and removed her robe, laying it over the bench. Today, she said, this courtroom is no longer a place where the system shields itself from scrutiny. Today, the system is on trial. She turned to the gallery. If you have experienced misconduct at the hands of this courthouse speak, you will be heard one by one. More people stood, an elderly veteran, a domestic violence survivor, a former public defender. The courtroom transformed into something raw and sacred, not a chamber of law, but a space of reckoning, of long overdue acknowledgement. Danielle's voice carried the weight of 1,000 silences being broken. This institution cannot heal what it refuses to confront, and I refuse to let silence win by the day's end. Danielle had authorized a full external audit of Westbridge Courthouse procedures, ordered the unsealing of all historical complaints, and requested federal oversight for future civil rights cases. It was more than a hearing. It was a tectonic shift. Danielle knew that some would call her dramatic. Others would question her objectivity. But she no longer cared about legacy or reputation. What mattered now was truth. And as she walked out of the courtroom that evening, her head held high, despite the scar left by Dempsey's razor, she knew this was the beginning of a new kind of justice, one born not in silence, but in the courage to speak. Justice for far too long had been defined by tradition, by robed men behind mahogany benches, by sealed files and silent hallways. But on a crisp Monday morning, Judge Danielle Carter stood in front of a packed courtroom and did something rarely seen in a federal courthouse. She rewrote the rules. With unwavering authority and a voice steady with purpose, she announced the Carter Mandate, an unprecedented reform policy aimed at dismantling the very culture that allowed systemic abuse to take root. The mandate required all courthouse staff to undergo rigorous anti-bias training, yearly psychological evaluations, and a zero-tolerance accountability framework for misconduct. No longer would "I didn't know" be an excuse. No longer would silence be protection. From the moment her gavel struck, change wasn't a request, it was law. The weight of her next action hung in the air like a storm about to break. She turned to Deputy Mark Dempsey, now stripped of his badge and shackled in the defendant's seat. Her eyes did not flinch as she recounted his crimes, not just the physical violation against her, but a documented pattern of harassment abuse and racial targeting spanning nearly a decade. The courtroom fell silent as she delivered the sentence, 35 years in federal prison, the maximum penalty allowed under the Civil Rights Enforcement Act. There would be no leniency, no negotiation, and no second chance. Danielle's voice never trembled. "This is not retribution," she said. "This is precedent." She then ordered an independent commission to audit the conduct of every supervisor, judge, and administrator who had signed off on or buried complaints. No one, she made clear, would be above scrutiny, not even those who once mentored her. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and headlines exploded. But what mattered more was what began quietly in courtrooms across the country. Federal judges from Chicago to Atlanta requested copies of the Carter Mandate law schools, began integrating Danielle's reforms into their ethics curriculum. Young clerks carried her speeches in their backpacks, quoting her like gospel. Danielle never intended to become a symbol, but her courage lit a fuse under the judiciary. Activists called her the new Thurgood, while newspapers hailed her as the voice of the gavel. But for Danielle, the fame was irrelevant. What mattered was that her mandate was no longer just policy. It was a movement, a blueprint for a new kind of justice, transparent, human, and unafraid. Despite the waves of attention, Danielle remained grounded in the work. Every week she met with courthouse employees, janitors, interns, guards, and clerks alike to listen, to check in, and to dismantle the invisible hierarchies that kept people quiet. She implemented anonymous reporting tools, mental health resources, and mandatory diversity panels. Judges who once dismissed these efforts as performative now found themselves defending their own records. The Westbridge Courthouse became a national model, its hallways buzzing, not with whispers of fear, but with policies built on trust and dignity. Danielle even invited past victims of courthouse abuse to join advisory boards, proving that the very people the system had failed would now help shape it. But reform came at a cost. Danielle received hate mail from traditionalists and veiled warnings from political insiders who feared her momentum. She was offered lucrative appointments to step away from the bench to become a figurehead rather than a force. She declined every offer. The courtroom is not a stage, she told one network, it's a mirror. And until we like what we see in it, we have work to do. Her family worried, her friends urged rest. But Danielle pressed on, not for glory, not for revenge, but for every anonymous name on every buried complaint that was never supposed to be heard. And as spring bloomed outside the courthouse, Danielle Carter stood again in courtroom 2B, this time beside a newly hired class of young clerks, each chosen not just for their credentials, but for their empathy and resolve. She spoke softly, but with power. Justice isn't something we wear. It's something we do. And doing it right means doing it loud, doing it boldly, and doing it for those who never had a seat in this room. Her robe hung slightly off her shoulders, her natural hair now worn proudly in tight coils, and the seal of the United States behind her gleamed in quiet solidarity. Justice had not only been served, it had been redefined. The grand hall of the Lincoln Center was hushed in reverence as the President of the United States stepped forward with the nation's highest legal honor in hand, the Presidential Medal of Justice. The air was thick with emotion, cameras flashing softly behind a sea of dignitaries and guests. At the center of it all stood Judge Danielle Carter, her head held high, her poise as unshakable as ever. Surrounding her were those who had walked beside her in silence, in struggle and in solidarity. Reverend James Hill, the civil rights leader, who had prayed with her after her first hearing as a young judge. Maya Green, the intern, who once feared speaking up but now led a coalition of courthouse reform advocates. And a dozen young students, most of them women of color, who called her not just Judge Carter, but our North Star. The applause that followed was not just for the medal, it was for the movement. In the weeks that followed the image of Danielle standing firm behind her courtroom bench, head unbowed, robe trailing like armor swept across the nation. Murals were painted, university lectures quoted. Her Carter Mandate editorials dissected her sentencing language with admiration. But beyond the accolades, something more profound began to take root. Local governments instituted bias audits. Police departments adopted the Carter Protocols for transparency. Even medical boards and academic institutions took note, finally acknowledging the deep systemic inequities embedded in their foundations. Danielle's legacy was no longer confined to a courtroom. It had become a mirror held up to the nation's conscience. But for Danielle, the work never paused. Fame never distracted her. She returned quietly to Westbridge Courthouse, where echoes of old injustices had once haunted the halls. Now those echoes were fading, replaced by new voices, new energy, and a new culture grounded in dignity and vigilance. She made it a point to meet every new hire in person, regardless of role. From courtroom translators to janitors, she reminded them that justice doesn't begin at the bench. It begins in how people are treated every day. Her office door remained open. Her chambers hosted community roundtables. Her rulings, still sharp and grounded in law, began including restorative notes, urging not just punishment, but education and healing. On her daily walks through the building, Danielle was greeted with nods, not of fear, but of gratitude. The marble floor that once echoed with her isolated steps now bore the stride of progress. No longer was she the woman who had to fight to be seen. She was the architect of a system where no one would have to fight just to belong. The very courtroom where she was once humiliated had been renamed the Carter Room, not just in honor of her achievements, but as a promise to all who would one day enter it. Law schools brought students to tour it. Survivors came to tell their stories within its safe space. And Danielle, often watching from behind the tinted glass above, knew the work was far from over, but it was moving forward. Every year, on the anniversary of the Carter Mandate, Danielle hosted a private ceremony. Not for press, not for politicians, but for the unseen hands of justice, the survivors who spoke up, the employees who chose ethics over fear, the interns who now ran legal clinics in underfunded cities. She kept a journal filled with handwritten letters from those whose lives had changed because of her stand. In one entry, a young girl named Layla wrote, "Because of you, I don't just want to be a judge. I want to be the kind of judge who listens." Danielle reread that letter often. It reminded her why she stayed, why she fought, and why no medal could ever outweigh the simple power of being heard. As the sun set on another long but purposeful day, Danielle stood at the courthouse steps, watching the city buzz with life. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass doors, not as a solitary figure, but as the culmination of generations who had marched, bled, and hoped for this very moment. She smiled, knowing her legacy would not be a plaque on a wall or a medal in a case, but a pathway. A pathway she carved through resistance, lit with truth, and left wide open for those still finding their courage. In the world of law, few get to rewrite the rules. Danielle Carter didn't just rewrite them, she reshaped the room in which they were read. If this story moved you, it's time to take action. Subscribe to Deep Inside HQ for more powerful, true-to-life narratives that reveal hidden truths, confront systemic injustice, and celebrate those who rise above it all. Share this video to spark real conversations about power, equity, and change, and leave a comment with your thoughts on how we can build a more just world together. Your voice matters here.